Welcome to all of you in the room and online to today's panel titled "The Future of Peace Operations: Insights for Women from Women, Peace and Security, Security Sector Governance and Protection of Civilians." So we're going to spend the next hour and a half discuss how this people-centered approach actually in peace operations is so important, and also sharing lessons to help all of us think through how we can generate the next and shape the next generation of peace missions and peace operations. But before delving into the topic and going to our participants, I would like to hand over the floor to our distinguished, let's say, introduction with Miss Marie Humeau, who is the first secretary to the Netherlands mission to the UN here in Geneva. So please, Marie, the floor is yours. Thank you so much for introducing that session.
Good morning, and thank you, Beatrice, for the kind. First of all, yeah, now it works. Well, I'll thank you again then. Thank you, Beatrice, for the kind introduction. First of all, a warm welcome to everyone. It's really a pleasure and an honor for me to deliver this opening remark for this important panel on the future of peace operation. We, the Netherlands, are really grateful for DCAF and CIVIC, two of our valued partners, for convening this timely discussion. Indeed, the international security landscape is constantly evolving. This means that UN peacekeeping is operating in an increasingly complex and contested environment. In addition, just last week, the UN announced that due to financial constraint, a quarter of deployed peacekeepers will withdraw from their missions. While it's clear that reforms are necessary to adapt and improve, we must keep in mind that UN peace operations continue to be an effective and important multilateral tool for preventing and mitigating armed conflict. Against this background, the Netherlands is proud to have co-hosted the UN Preparatory Conference on the future of UN peacekeeping this February. And we look forward to continue this conversation today and during the Geneva Peace Week, a forum to connect, build synergies, and reflect on our direction moving forward. In this spirit, I will share some reflection focusing on protection of civilians, security sector governance, and women, peace, and security. First of all, the protection and safety of civilians, especially women and girls, remains a major challenge in many contexts and crises. It is extremely worrying that civilians increasingly become direct targets of hostilities and violence. Therefore, it's essential that peacekeeping continue to contribute to the protection of civilians. It is and should remain at the core of its works. Hereby, the Netherlands advocates for a people-centered approach to ensure that the needs, interest, and solution of those we aim to protect, the civilians, are at the heart of our efforts. For this, effective community engagement and civil society consultation are essential. On the security and sector governance, secondly, the success of any peace operation depends on strengthening the institution that keeps communities safe. Therefore, the Netherlands highlights the importance of security sector reform capacity and mission effectiveness, including supports to the UN Security Sector Reform Unit in collaboration with our partner DCAF. Thirdly, on women, peace, and security. Peace is more sustainable when women play an active and meaningful role in its creation. There are evidence that when women are engaging in conflict prevention and resolution, the outcome significantly improves. This year marked the 25th anniversary of the UNSC Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security. In these 25 years, many within the international community have made great efforts to advance this agenda, including in UN peace operations. However, it remains of crucial importance to support the full, equal, and meaningful participation of women in all their diversity. For example, women peacemakers can help build trust and confidence with communities and improve access and support for local women in ways that their male counterparts aren't always able to. This is why the Netherlands continues to contribute to the LC Initiative Fund to support troop and police contributing countries, TPCCS, in identifying barriers, challenges, and opportunities to increase the participation of women in peacekeeping. And to conclude, I'm coming to my conclusion. The importance of protecting of civilian security sector governance and women peace and security within the future of UN peace operation is clear. Today's discussion provides an opportunity to share synergies and insights that contribute to a people-centered, responsive, gender-sensitive, and effective UN peacekeeping mission. With this in mind, it's my great pleasure to hand the floor back to Beatrice to moderate this discussion. And I look forward to the insight and recommendation that will emerge from today's exchange and to continuing our close collaboration with partners to strengthen the impact of peace operation. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Marie. We are very, very grateful of your introducing this roundtable today, and very grateful for the support of the Netherlands, both to DCAF and to Civic Walk organizers to this event. And I realize I did not introduce myself. I'm Beatrice Godefroy, Deputy Director at DCAF, and I'll be your moderator for today, indeed. So just a couple of words to sort of set the scene for the conversation before turning to our distinguished panelists, because indeed, I think we're very lucky to have this conversation at the Geneva Peace Week this year. It's a very timely momentum for discussing the question of the future of peace operations. It's timely momentum because, of course, there is the ongoing review, and we're expecting a report in 2026. But also, of course, it's a momentum when it comes to discussing in the context of a shortening of the resources that affects the mission and the peace operations in general, as well as, of course, we see more and more challenges to which the missions are being exposed in terms of the historic surge of armed conflict, in terms of the complexity of the conflicts, in terms of the variety of threats posed to states and to communities, obviously. So there is definitely a momentum and a call for more flexibility, adaptability of the missions. And at the same time, also being mindful of the risks potentially that this flexibility or this adaptation may carry if there is a lack of prioritization of what is absolutely crucial to the effectiveness and to the success of peace operations. And the people sitting at the table here will, I suppose, argue that it's absolutely essential that the people-centered approach, the human security dimension, looking at this through the lens of security sector governance, of women, peace and security, and of protection of civilians as sort of different components of it, that it's this is not peripheral to the success of the mandate. It's actually central and crucial. So should not certainly be sidelined. So with this, indeed, we're going to look more specifically at these three aspects. So let me just sort of try and scope them a little bit before we get started. With regards to security sector governance, the success of any peace operation depends on strengthening those institutions which keep the community safe. You mentioned that very well in your introduction, Marie. And so strong, accountable, and inclusive security sectors help build trust in the state and prevent return to countries. So there is this strategic dimension of SSGs that I think we will discuss in the conversation. When it comes to protection of civilians from violence, it's a core responsibility of peace operations. But lasting safety requires legitimacy with regards to from local authorities, actually, and authorities which are able to resume responsibility over time. And finally, when it comes to women, peace and security, and especially through the lens of gender equality, promoting it in the missions improves mission effectiveness. And you will share lessons learned to that point and ensure the perspective that all people are considered in the peace building process. Again, having in mind linking inclusivity, effectiveness, and success of the missions. So with this, and to explore these questions, I would like to turn to our distinguished panels of practitioners and experts. We're very, very lucky and honored, actually, to have been able to bring together this panel today, both from DCAF, Civic, and UN departments of political and peace-building affairs and peace operations. So they will share their practical insights and lessons from the field and reflect also on what works, what doesn't work, and how this experience can help shape the next generation of UN peace operations, as we were saying. So I'm very thrilled to turn to our panelists, but I have also a role to be sort of briefing you on the housekeeping notes for the panel. So we are very lucky to have this panel as a hybrid meeting, so it's being recorded. So no Chatham House rules for today. And after the event, we will circulate a summary of key messages and recommendations, as well as the link to the recording will be a little bit later, I think, on the platform of the Geneva Peace Week. So there will be possibility for those colleagues and friends joining online to put their question in the chat. And we have a colleague in the room here who will help us read those questions. For in-person participants and for participants online, please sign up. So for people in the room, we have paper sheets, old style. And for online participants, you can register via a survey link shared in the chat. Okay, so this is being said. So now we'd like to turn to our first panelist, Vincenza Scherer. You're the head of policy engagement at DCAF, and with 2 decades of experience in security sector governance and reform, including as advisor to the UN Security Sector Reform Unit in New York. So could you please kick us off with explaining why strong, accountable, and inclusive security sectors are so central to peace operations and to subsequent transitions? Over to you, Vincenza.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Beatrice. Let me start by emphasizing that peace operations cannot succeed if the institutions meant to keep people safe remain part of the problem. Strong, accountable, and inclusive security sectors are essential not only to protect civilians today, but also to prevent the cycles of violence that can undermine peace tomorrow. At its core, security sector governance is a prevention tool. Many of the root causes of violence, whether repression, exclusion, lack of accountability, stem from dysfunctional or abusive security institutions. And so unless peace operations engage with the governance of the security sector, they cannot transform the conditions that gave rise to the conflict in the first place. And when this is done right, this work can save lives and build trust. Accountability ensures that security actors uphold human rights, reducing the risk of abuse. Inclusion, especially gender inclusion, strengthens legitimacy and helps security services meet the needs of all communities. In short, good governance of the security sector ensures that security institutions serve the people and not just the powerful. But this is not only about long-term prevention, it's also vital to effective transitions of peace operations. Without progress on security sector governance, missions cannot genuinely support nationally led protection of civilians. They remain trapped in a substitute role where the UN provides the protection directly. Security sector governance, in that sense, is about building the foundations for a responsible transition and ultimately for a sustainable exit. A persistent challenge, however, is that SSG is often seen as a long-term effort, leading to delays in supporting this until the conditions are right. But by this time, critical gaps may be difficult to address. This risk is likely to grow as missions become smaller and lighter in the context of this liquidity or budgetary crisis that Beatrice alluded to. The SG's recent report, Shifting Paradigms, United to Deliver, as part of its broader UN80 reforms, has called for delegating civilian mandates, such as the rule of law and governance, to the UN entities best equipped to implement them. But in practice, many UN country teams still lack the resources to take on these roles, particularly in areas like security sector governance. So this really raises important questions about how future peace operations will be able to meet the security sector governance related demands that are so vital for sustaining peace and for protecting people.
Thank you, Vincenza. And so well noted indeed, security sector governance being important in the short and midterm for missions, in terms of the legitimacy, in terms of the need to serve the people and all the people, and at the same time, of course, for the transition and for the longer term. Thank you very much for that. I'm turning now to Wendy. You're the director of the UN United Nations Program at the Center for Civilians in Conflict, Civic, and leading strategic policy engagement and advocacy to the UN to advance reforms which are essential to the protection of civilians. And you bring 20 years of experience on this topic, working in conflict, humanitarian crises, and in field-based and policy roles. So could you share with us why protection of civilians is a core pillar of peace operations and how POC efforts contribute to long-term stability?
Thanks very much, Beatrice. I'm speaking on behalf of Civic, an NGO which is focused on protection of civilians, but also as a former, like Vincenza, a former peacekeeper. So it comes both from sort of our work now, but also my own sort of personal experience in different roles in the UN system, both in the field and at headquarters. I actually moved to Civic because of what I saw was a really worrying trend in civilian harm, which is unfortunately growing ever higher. So just to start with this personal note, so Civic is about to release a report later this month looking at civilian protection trends sort of globally. And it shows the 10% increase in civilian casualties from 2024 from 2023. But in 2023, that number was over 70%. And all of the rates for sexual violence and conflict, for grave violations against children, those are all moving upward. Like these trends are moving in the wrong direction. So we are fighting against this enormous tide at exactly the time when we have this downward pressure on resources and sort of shrinking capacities for peace. So it's really the elephant in the room for these conversations. How do we do what we have always been trying to do, but under these extremely difficult circumstances? And I would posit, and why we have the panel today, is that despite their shortcomings, peace operations, UN peace operations, remain one of the best tools we have in the sort of multilateral toolbox to keep people safe in war. All of the evidence, that's not my opinion, all of the evidence backs that. We also know that we need to try and adapt those operations for the risks that I just mentioned in a rapidly changing world. So we see these essentially 3 points for why POC is at the center of peace operations. So we don't see it as a sort of discrete standalone mandated activity, but really at the heart of the missions themselves and core to them achieving their sort of core mandated purpose, which is essentially building safe, legitimate, and resilient societies. So one, it's the moral and operational really underpinning or foundation of peace operations, protecting civilians. And essentially, it's what distinguishes peace operations from military interventions by themselves, right? It's rooted in international law, but it's also the clearest expression of a mission's legitimacy in the eyes of local communities. And that's a really important point. So when civilians feel safer, when they see that their protection matters, peacekeepers gain trust, intelligence, cooperation that make all of the other mission objectives achievable. So in this way, it's this enabler for those other mandated tasks. We see it as a pathway to long-term prevention and stability. From examples in South Sudan, Mali, and Ukraine, where we work, we see that civilian protection reduces cycles of retaliation and displacement. We see when we've used civ-mil dialogues, for example, between civilians and militaries, it creates pathways for exchange, which can help people really help their own security and build in this sort of national capacity for security, for resuming their responsibility for protecting their own civilians. And there are great examples across peacekeeping, like early warning systems and community alert networks, where we've really seen quite directly how this kind of engagement saves lives. So in this way, preventing civilian harm and not just responding to it really reduces grievances that often can fuel renewed cycles of violence and turn immediate protection into longer term peace building. And because of that, it's an investment into inclusive peace. So it's not only a humanitarian imperative, but one that's really an investment in longer term stability.
Thank you so much, Wendy, for articulating for us in just a few minutes the link between really the protection of civilians with all this dimension in terms of immediate reduction of civilian harm, but at the same time how it links to the peace building aspect and to longer term, hopefully positive impact on inclusive peace. Thank you so much. So I'm delighted to now turn to Marie-Noëlle. So you are the head of the strategic planning cell at MONUSCO with 2 decades of experience in the UN system. And oh, I'm so sorry, Marie-Noël, you are the program management officer at the United Nations Office for Coordination and Shared Services.
We got together.
Yeah, exactly. Serving the departments of political and peacebuilding affairs and peace operations. And you are specialized on gender affairs, and you have had previous experience in the UN system, both in HQ and field level. So apologies for the confusion. Could you tell us why the WPS agenda is so critical for peace operations, and what difference does it make on the ground?
Thank you very much. I'd be delighted to tell you about that. But first of all, I would like to thank DCAF and Civic for organizing this very timely discussion today. And I also look forward to the Q&A session later that will hopefully be quite interactive. So when we look at the WPS agenda and related strategies and priorities, such as the Uniform Gender Parity Strategy that promotes the uniform participation of women in peacekeeping, something that I will focus in my interaction today, it's important to recall and underline that for us, it's really about promoting the UN's values, about creating equal opportunities for women and men, but it's also about operational effectiveness and impact. Over the past 7 years, we have more than doubled the share of uniformed women deployed to peacekeeping. And from this experience, we can say that having women participate in a full, equal, and meaningful way in peace operations helps us to perform better and enjoy greater legitimacy, something that my colleagues already alluded to. And because our peacekeeping force has become more diverse over the years, with women and men serving together side by side, we are able to access greater creativity, innovation, and are more flexible in our problem solving, something that I think we can all agree is very handy in the fast changing environments in which peace operations are located in. If we look at reasons why this is, and I think most of us are familiar with this one, and Marie mentioned it in her introductory remarks as well, is that when we have women participate alongside men, we can access all parts of the population, and that really transforms our protection strategies. We can talk to women and girls, men and boys, voices that might have otherwise gone unheard or unseen. And this really broadens our situational awareness. It deepens the trust that we have with the local population and directly strengthens our protection of civilian work. Similarly, if we have diverse teams working together on planning, we can ensure that we look at the security landscape from different lenses and not just a single security perspective. And when it comes to threat anticipation, this is really crucial. We also have to face the fact that when we have diverse teams with diverse life experiences, skills, and communication profiles as well, we can really help to ease tensions and mediate conflicts that might occur in day-to-day operations inside the base as well as outside. And a recent example comes from the United Nations mission in South Sudan, where in April this year, our colleagues went on a mixed gender patrol team, so composed of women and men, and they were able to prevent a major attack on a boarding school by mediating a truce between 2 rival villages after having engaged with all parts of the population, effectively processing the information and adjusting their protection strategies accordingly. And of course, in such a success story, there are multiple variables that are at play, but I think it's really important to acknowledge that when we have a strong team with diverse skills and perspectives, this really can make a big difference. And then, of course, when it comes to security sector governance, as mentioned, we also have a strong empowerment ripple effect, or this famous role model effect. First, on the side of the local community members that will see the colleagues working side by side in security roles, it sends a strong signal, maybe even encouraging girls and women to take on active roles in peace operations one day or peacekeeping. And then, of course, it also sends a strong signal to the national security institutions. It says, Professional and accountable security institutions are inclusive and representatives of the populations they serve. So the lesson is clear: diversity is a capability, and it shouldn't be just about a normative commitment. It's an operational necessity for us. Not investing in it is both a missed opportunity and a strategic mistake.
Thank you very much, Marianne, for really highlighting of course, the normative aspect of the topic, but very much so the operational effectiveness component and the impact you're seeking in terms of increasing the capability of the mission through more parity in the team. So thank you so much for that. And just on one note, actually, if I may, because this topic is also very dear to the heart of DCAF, as you know, and I wanted to have the chance to mention that through the LC initiative, we published recently a report, The Future of Peacekeeping Needs Everyone. So I suppose we will be able to put the link actually somewhere in the chat or after the conference. And I think it speaks very much to exactly what you mentioned in terms of source of sustainable commitment in the country. With this, I'm turning now to you, Daniel. We have heard actually from our colleagues about the security sector governance component, the protection of civilian aspect, the women, peace and security. And so we're absolutely delighted to have you here in this panel to help us pull all these different strengths together and how they link to in the practical context of a mission. So Daniel Meyer, you're the head of strategic planning of the strategic planning cell at MONUSCO, with 2 decades of experience in the UN, in particular in MONUSCO in DRC, where you have been working for 14 years. So from your field experience, can you share with us if there is a shared understanding across missions about the importance of SSG, POC, WPS, and where have operations struggled to integrate these pillars effectively, and what obstacles you have observed? So that's not just one question.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Beatrice, DCAF, and Civic for having me here as part of the panel. I mean, obviously, you're asking a very, big question. I'd like to take us back to 2008 when the Department for Peacekeeping Operations published its capstone doctrine. If you look back into that principles and priorities of peace operations or peacekeeping, you would notice that the multidimensional aspect is very much reflected in the themes that we are discussing this afternoon, and they are inextricably linked. It's difficult to take out the POC element by not addressing the security sector. We heard that also from Vincenza. It is also important to look into the women, peace and security processes, as we heard from Marie-Noël, as part of the management of a mission, but also as part of our engagement strategies with the population and the government, civil society, etc. I think, for the purpose of the discussion, what is important is to note that peace operations work with host governments in a context of, state reform at large. So we, cannot just single out the security sector if we don't look at the overall, context the country is in, and the region quite often, if we look into the areas where peace operations are deployed. If you look into also the development, 25 years of protection of civilian mandates, it has become clear that there is an expectation towards United Nations to also have robust mandates according to Chapter 7. But the reality is that neutralizing armed groups is something that is not understood by all TCCs, by all also actors the same way. And when the United Nations become party to the conflict, it becomes also very much, an issue to address the other mandate areas. I'm sure the audience is aware of other discussions around sequencing of mandates. You also have to look into the security sector as a generational project, and even countries that are stable have to reform their own security sector. But what does it mean in our context in the DRC? I would say one element, of course, is the political dimension of it. We are not resourced enough to provide large-scale infrastructure projects, for instance, for the army or the police, but we can work with the government and the National Security Advisor and the institutions that have been set up to develop a national security policy and also platforms, opportunities for the discussion of, how the security sector and the institutions should be set up. There's an element also of decentralization. You have a huge country, 26 provinces. You have to look into the way how the capital is actually working also with the provinces. And then, of course, we have to look into a situation at the moment where M23, Alliance Fleuve Congo, are present in large parts of the North Kivu province and actually in South Kivu, where the mission withdrew its forces last year on the basis of a joint disengagement plan. And here we come back to the capstone doctrine, because it said two things as well. You need functioning security institutions in order to create the conditions for the drawdown, but you also need a programmatic approach and actually having a sustainable, impact. And assessed contributions, as you know, that are used for peacekeeping, use since 2017 programmatic funds to also engage with the different ministries that are in charge, Ministry of the Interior, Defense, Human Rights, and others. And it has become much more important, let's say, to work with agencies, funds, and programs in this regard. But it is important to keep in mind that peacekeeping as a political, so to say, mission will not be able to provide the bulk, so to say, of these programmatic funds. And I think when we talk about the future of peace operations, it is very important that we look into the partnership approaches. Not everything has to be provided by the mission, so to say, in the country, but it can help to coordinate and to deconflict also some of the initiatives, so that whenever bilateral partners come in or multilateral partners come in with a funding opportunity, can build on the consensus that has been established. I think these are some of the key points. In terms of women, peace, and security, I also wanted to say that it's not only the internal dimension and in terms of increasing women's participation in peace operations. For us, it's also an agenda to engage women and youth also in the country itself. So we have created in MONUSCO Les Ambassadrices de la Paix, a network of young women engaging in political processes, but also around the peace process in itself, the Nairobi talks, where women's groups were present and actually, due to the intervention from the mission, were able to participate and have their famous, seat around the table. So there are some good examples also in this regard.
Yeah, thank you. These are very inspiring, actually. And thanks for also putting into perspective some of the challenges, including that, let's say, balance or tension between the different parts of the mandate in terms of neutralization of armed groups versus indeed the sort of more human security dimension, protection of civilian WPSSSG, but how we can actually create also synergies potentially between them. So thank you very much to all the panelists for already sort of setting the stage for us in terms of why this matters in the context of the review of peace operations. The second round of question will be actually more focused on the lessons we have learned from previous experiences, previous operations or missions. And so I would like really to turn to all of you with the same question, which is actually what have we learned from previous efforts that should inform how peace operations are designed and supported in the future, and in particular how that can make them more effective, adaptable, sustainable. So I'll start again with you, Vincenza, to kick us off. Thanks.
Thanks, Beatrice. Okay, so I'd like to share 3 key lessons drawn largely from a DCAF study on security sector reform mandates and peace operations that we conducted at the request of Switzerland during its chairmanship of the Security Council, presidency of the Security Council. So first, missions must focus on what matters most through a people-centered lens. And we heard the emphasis on people-centered as well, made by Marie. There's much discussion about moving away from the large multidimensional missions of the past, not least in the context of this budgetary crisis. But the real question isn't whether missions should be large or small. It's really about prioritizing interventions that make a tangible difference in the lives of people. And that's why mandates, and in particular, the resources allocated to those mandates matter, because without the right safeguards, we tend to see that politically convenient tasks are prioritized, while sensitive governance reforms, the ones that can actually make a long-term difference to the people, are often sidelined or forgotten about. And this is already happening today, even in ongoing multidimensional missions. I mean, I've mentioned it before, but if you look at the protection of civilians, DCAF's review shows that SSR is not systematically included as a priority under protection of civilian mandates. But we know that without addressing the governance of the security sector, missions cannot deliver on those long-term needs. So addressing this gap requires dedicated in-mission expertise. And we know that security sector governance often involves deeply political and sensitive issues. And these conversations cannot happen without the good offices of the senior leadership. But that senior leadership requires some kind of SSR advisory support in order to be able to hold, to facilitate those difficult conversations. Also, the complexity of peace operations means that the type of expertise needed varies with evolving circumstances. So at one moment, you might need someone who can provide advice on human resource management of the security sector. At other moments, it's more about facilitation of peace discussions, etc. So it evolves. And yet we know, as the Senior Advisory Group report on civilian capacities of already 2011 noted, that the UN too often relies on its own personnel to perform all tasks, even when they fall outside of their own competence. Similarly, reviews of UN police and of the Office of Military Affairs also highlight that technical experts there are frequently expected to act as mentors or institution builders without having the necessary expertise to do this. And so what really matters, whether in multidimensional or in light footprint missions, wherever we may go, is really maintaining a minimum in-mission capacity to ensure that this political support can continue, and also to identify reform opportunities when the time is right. And then that can then be addressed by the UN or by external partners in line with this kind of more networked modular approach that we're talking about. And, obviously regional organizations have a role to play, but also bilateral actors can be leveraged more. I mean, they often have very specific expertise from their own processes of, human resource management, all these very technical things, oversight, etc., and also very specialized institutions. And this would then enable accessing that more specialized expertise that may be needed. So how do we ensure proper prioritization? And this brings me to my second point, which is that prevention, and by that I mean prevention of violence, must underpin the design and implementation of peace operations. Peace operations really must go beyond managing the symptoms. While they're meant to be guided by the primacy of politics, we know that political strategies often focus narrowly on reaching or maintaining agreements without tackling the underlying drivers of violence. And as a result, those drivers of violence are often still unresolved at the time that the mission begins to transition. If we look at Darfur, for instance, AU-UN report prepared in the context of transition planning had noted that while armed violence had declined, the fundamental conflict drivers remained unresolved and was fueling tensions, intercommunal tensions. This is also echoed in our SSR study on mandates, which saw that SSR mandates are rarely linked explicitly to drivers of conflict. They're often framed at very much a technical level, missing the opportunity to address structural risks or to advance political solutions. And worse, misaligned mandates can sometimes even fuel new grievances. If we take, for instance, extending state authority through the security sector, which we found to be a common task, this can backfire if not done, or if done without legitimacy and accountability, because when the state is perceived as abusive, expanding its reach can actually deepen mistrust and trigger further violence. And so to improve alignment with prevention, peace operations strategies should really be grounded in rigorous analysis of conflict drivers, including those related to the security sector. There's all this talk now about national prevention strategies. And if there's a move towards more of those built around these risk factors, this could be a promising entry point if they're evidence-based. And this could help guide mandate design, inform adaptation, shape exit strategies, and enable closer relationships with the Peacebuilding Commission and PBSO. And third, my final point is that sustainability must be built in from day one. Too often, sustainability is treated as something to worry about only at the end, so during transition. But transitions are the real stress test of peace operations, and too often they fail because these governance foundations were not laid early enough. And our review shows that good governance is still the missing piece. Key elements like really building institutional capacity in terms of independent oversight, in terms of financial management, are often overlooked. And investment in national capacities to lead and coordinate SSG efforts tends to come too late. We see, if you look at the mandates, they start talking about this right before the transition, when really this needs to be thought about way in advance. And that delay has a cost. When national authorities assume full responsibility for security, spending often skyrockets, military spending it. Just look at the DRC. In 2023, military spending more than doubled amid rising tensions and the anticipated withdrawal of the major UN peacekeeping mission. And in fragile contexts, this can mean diverting resources away from essential services, which can deepen inequalities, reignite grievances. So transitions that were meant to mark progress actually fuel instead instability. So to avoid this, sustainability must be planned from the outset. Integrating SSR into national development and budgeting processes so that reforms are really nationally owned, strategically aligned, and financially viable. And it means investing early in the people and systems that carry reforms forward, building leadership, institutions, and accountability mechanisms that will outlast the mission itself.
Thank you so much, Vincenza. And so early investment, and at the same time being mindful that we need this minimum in mission capacity, especially if we want also not only to be better at mandate implementation, but also at avoiding actually fueling other grievances instead of going against the implementation of the mandate. So I'm turning to you now, Wendy, with the same question in terms of sharing lessons. And we're running a little bit late, so if we can stick to 5-6 minutes for the second round, that would be fantastic. Thank you.
In a way, easy, because I agree with everything that Vincenza has said. It will be difficult not to repeat, but I mean, it just shows that the consensus is really, on the research at least, I think is really very clear about what some of these lessons are. And I would maybe pick up from your last point about integrating SSR into national budgeting and kind of strategic political processes. I think the same can be true actually for protection of civilians in WPS as well, right? Because I mean, what we're saying is that these are three, not just agendas, but and sort of three separate mandated task areas, but they are absolutely three sort of legs of the same stool, if you can think of it that way. I mean, one way to think of it is POC, you know, from our perspective, tells us sort of what peace operations have to ultimately achieve, which is sort of immediate safety and sort of dignity and stability for civilians. WPS, in a way, tells us how. How do we get there? Ensuring women's leadership, participation, representation, and SSR, a little bit about who sustains it, right? Like really embedding these things in national institutions and national kind of strategic priorities and political priorities to make sure that you have accountable institutions who ultimately will represent and protect their people, right? I mean, that's actually what we're ultimately going for. So maybe I start by that first lesson, which is really linking these three agendas as sort of inextricable. And if you try to de-link them, I mean, you'll just fall short at the sort of bottom of it. And I think at the heart of those efforts is not only sort of keeping them together, but making sure that that ownership is built in from the beginning, as you said, to the extent that that's possible. security isn't only delivered and sort of owned, it isn't only delivered by sort of the UN and partners, but it has to be something that's also owned by the state. I'd say the second lesson is around, and this won't surprise you as a humanitarian organization, but that we need to center missions or any sort of presence, right? Because we don't know what they're going to look like in the future, around people, right? And not just around mandates. I think we have spent, and I know that, you know, this is true from civic side, we've spent a lot of effort making sure that the mandates are as sort of precise as they need to be to let the folks in the field do the job as best that they can, while still giving them sort of flexibility. But in a way, we've moved quite a bit past that, where we're really trying to think outside the box about what those presences look like. There's a lot of discussion around sort of modular approaches and new kinds of configurations. I think at the end, no matter what they look like, they do have to be centered around not just sort of political processes and ceasefires as a sort of, you know, a discrete set of tasks, but really this whole of mission, whole of UN system, whole of multilateral system approach, where we link the political, security, human rights pillars, right? That these three agendas in particular we're talking about today have to be linked. There's lots of good examples of good practice: civilian harm tracking, community kind of engagement and liaison, gender responsive analysis in every one of those components, whether it's military, police, or civilian. And yeah, no matter what the sort of future looks like, that has to be embedded. And I think the last one is around making protection measurable and accountable. And resourced, right? So it's a bit of a cheat, this third lesson, because it lumps a lot of things in it, but it's basically the operationalization of it, right? Like, how do we do that? Again, regardless of sort of what it looks like, we do have to make sure that everyone is on the same page in terms of joint analysis, a point I think you made really well. And so much of the research comes back to that, right? Only by sort of coming together and really identifying what are those root causes, how do we identify sort of common objectives, and then how do we work together jointly, whatever the components look like on the ground. That has to be a really integrated effort. And that embedded in this sort of prevention approach, which should be the chapeau, which starts from the beginning, is flexibility and funding. And I know this sort of, you know, in a way goes without saying, but I'm going to say it anyway, because it's essential, right? It's essential. You know, circumstances change, risks are evolving every day, as I mentioned in the beginning. I had a colleague speaking earlier this morning on another panel coming from Kiev, talking about the huge rise in armed drones in the Ukraine, right? So if you look at sort of the source of risks, it's evolving hugely and very quickly, and we need to keep pace with that. Thanks.
Thank you so much. For the second time, I'm turning to you directly, Marie-Noëlle, in terms of sharing some of the lessons from your experience.
Yes, I think, as mentioned earlier, a clear lesson that we derive from implementing the WPS agenda, and thank you, Daniel, for adding this other powerful example on participation in peace processes, is that it enhances operational effectiveness and really makes peace operations better, and therefore peace outcomes more lasting. But let me also say that we have learned that we can only seize the benefits of diverse teams participating in peace operations when we have the full, equal, and meaningful participation of women in peace operations. And what I mean by that is that we need women in all roles, in logistics, intelligence, command, and leadership roles, and not just in support functions. I think this is very important to underline. And we also need proportionate representation. 2 years ago, I visited a military contingent in one of our bigger peace operations in a field office. There was one woman among 200 battalion members. And of course, I think we can agree that whenever there is a ratio of 1 to 200, we might maybe not feel particularly empowered to speak up and share our opinion. We will try to assimilate and kind of blend in. So for diversity to really strengthen operation, it must reach a critical mass where women are visible, supported, and an integral part of the team. But it's not just about numbers and representation. And I think this is very, very important to highlight. We also need to create an enabling and inclusive environment where everyone can perform up to their full potential. What do we mean by that? We mean the physical as well as the non-physical environment. So from how camps are designed and the physical infrastructure is on the ground, and to also, of course, the work culture that should be supported. And it goes without saying, it should be free from bias and harassment. And without these enabling conditions, the presence of diverse teams alone won't create an impact. So now, after learning these lessons, looking towards the future in the context of the review of peace operations, we can conclude that they must be gender responsive. And that means that they must take into consideration a gender perspective at strategic, operational, and tactical levels inside the base, but as well outside with everything that we do. And it also means having both women and men serving in these diverse roles in diverse ranks, including leadership. So when looking at this latter part, it's very difficult, as Wendy said, to predict what it really will look like and which capability will be required and mandated in the future. But it's important to take action today to be prepared and that these hard-won gender parity gains are not lost. And we need to start today to improve women's access across all diverse roles and functions and ranks. For this matter, I really liked the DCAF report and the notion on the need to kind of map out the skill profiles that might be required across different mandates. I think that's a very, very good point to kind of know what we will need to be prepared for, and then of course work closely with police and troop contributing countries to recruit, train, promote, and retain uniformed women across these diverse roles and functions. And specialized skills that might be required in mandates such as maybe marine mining or cybersecurity, they really take time to build. And if we don't have these leadership cadres in place, it might exacerbate existing gender gaps. At the same time, we have to maintain and strengthen uniformed women's deployments to roles where they are already well represented. And we can also look at functions we know that will be required across all different peace operations, like planning, for instance, and invest in making sure that women are represented in these areas as well. On our side, from the Department of Peace Operations, we are taking steps in this direction. We are right now working on improving cadres of uniformed women by mapping women's current representation, their skills, profiles, and deployed functions, and identify leadership positions where greater representation is needed. And at the same time, we're investing in gender responsive leadership training and support to leaders, as we identified that it can be quite a catalyst for change, for creating these enabling and inclusive work environments. Lastly, we're also piloting a network for uniformed women peacekeepers right now that connects women across missions and locations to support them in their deployment experience. So these are just some examples on the way forward.
Yeah, thank you. Very interesting and very practical examples of good practices that could be reproduced. Thank you. Daniel, what are some of the lessons that you have learned from MONUSCO and that could inform that debate?
Yeah, there are many lessons and we try to document those as well. I would say shared responsibilities and a sense of urgency. Shared responsibilities in a transition context is a key principle, you know, when you are basically withdrawing from a specific region and you have an infrastructure there, you have your bases, you have your offices, that you ensure that you have someone to hand over. There has been often a bit of a misunderstanding in terms of, you know, you look at one mandate in peace operations and then you look at UN agencies, funds and programs, but we deliberately decided not to hand over to an agency, but we hand over to the government. So this is the other principle about the national ownership. And then we had a very, let's say, rushed disengagement plan for South Kivu, but it was principled, and therefore I think it was also strong. And it said that before we leave, there has to be a handover, a formal handover. There has to be a ceremony. The population needs to see that we are handing over and to whom we are handing over, so that the responsibilities are also very clear. And it is also important that during this handover time, there is an understanding of what does it actually mean, protection of civilians. We should not be naive to think that because we have developed a doctrinal framework for the United Nations over decades, that this is one-to-one, accepted, so to say, by the population and also by the host government. So we need to look into, basically entry points. And here security sector governance also means that, and it was mentioned, the local security protection committees, for instance, that have been set up, they are to continue, they are to be consulted in the future. And for that, we needed to ensure that there will be funding and that there will be also, the support from the international community. So I think we have good examples from the transition and the drawdown over the past couple of years. Sense of urgency, I mentioned. The problem is we have 1-year mandates. And then, the budget comes half a year later in a way. If it was more predictable in terms of the resources that we can use, we would also be able to develop multi-year programs with, a clear understanding of how much also can be contributed. And I think a program approach would be important. It does not mean that security sector reform becomes a Gantt chart where you look into your activities, but you define benchmarks, you define your milestones. And my last point here would be, if you look into our mandate at the moment, 18 pages, 2/3 actually talk about the situation in the country and call to the government to implement also important reform initiatives. For me, this is an indication that when we go to the Security Council for the quarterly briefings, we talk about mandate implementation. We look into what the mission has also been doing. But I think in the longer term, when we look into the overall security sector governance aspects, it will be important to also understand what the governments are actually investing and what they believe should be the priorities. And we need to have also the opportunity to talk about progress through the perspective of the host governments and not only assessing the performance, so to say, of peace operations. I think that would be an important lesson for me to take away.
Yeah, thank you so much for bringing in this dimension of shared responsibility and local and national ownership. Definitely essential, as was highlighted by so other panelists in terms of the sustainability and the transition. So I'm looking at the time, and I think we have still a bit of time actually for Q&A from the room. So would like to turn actually to you here in person in Geneva and to friends and colleagues online. Whether we have any first question, who would like to kick us off? Do we have any question online? Yes? Okay, so let's start with online. It will inspire the room here in Geneva.
There's one question online from Lydia Good. Would you agree that one of the most successful peacekeeping missions is the Rwandan Defense Force in Cabo Delgado province in northern Mozambique? To that end, what do you see as emerging lessons in next generation's peace operation? Thank you.
Okay, so I don't know if one of the panelists wants to speak to Mozambique in particular or to the larger question. Yeah. Daniel, I'm turning to you. Not necessarily. Okay, Jensa?
I mean, not on Mozambique, but on larger lessons. I mean, I can pick up on that. I mean, I think one of the lessons, and I think Daniel was mentioning this, is really the need to build genuine partnerships, because as missions become lighter, more modular, you know, they can become agile but not self-sufficient, right? And so, you know, this is about then if the UN is delegating more civilian tasks, who will be at the table? And I think this is a little bit what Daniel was saying. And how do we bring in the IFIs that we haven't really mentioned yet, right? But the World Bank, et cetera, because I think that they have really an important role that can be better leveraged in these contexts. And but how do we make that link in the context of future peace operations? So yeah, I think that's one of the key kind of lessons is really better thinking through partnerships. Yeah.
I'd add one point to that, again, without being an expert in Mozambique, but I've heard the Swiss former special envoy speak about the experience, which is actually really instructive and has lots of very good lessons from it, which I will not try to replicate, which is to say that one of the elements that I understand of that success is really an understanding what the comparative advantage of the UN and sort of multilateral footprint is in that context. So just as you were saying, Vincenza, I mean, if it is a single special envoy and a small team of advisors, as it was in Mozambique, how do you leverage that? So obviously you can't provide physical protection. You don't have uniformed troops or police. You can't do very much community engagement, et cetera. But you can provide a good offices function. You can facilitate dialogue, you can do mediation. There's actually quite a lot that you can do. And I think this outside the box thinking where where we consider what are the comparative advantages of different actors. And again, don't just limit it to the UN mission, but the entire system, also including partners, regional partners, IFIs, et cetera. I mean, there's a lot of discussion now and actually very high, perhaps unrealistic expectations of what the AU is going to come in and how much of this can be handed over to regional organizations. That remains to be seen. But the fact that we are approaching these partnerships in a more conscious way, I think is long overdue.
Thank you.
Question on the left.
Sorry. So I see one hand here and there was over there. Okay, so let's go from my left to right. So the lady here. Yeah, thank you.
Hello, thank you very much. I'm Ilke from Sustainable Peace and Democratic Development. I wanted to ask about how contextual gender stereotypes play into having more uniformed women, whether they're positive stereotypes or negative. Women are seen as less corrupt, or they're seen as diminished executive decision-making power, or too emotional. How does this play into SSR? Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take a few questions before going back to the panel. So over there at the back. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Paola. I'm an LLM student here at the Institute. Thank you so much for this beautiful conference. My question is also regarding gender approach. So how can we ensure that gender diversity doesn't become just a checkbox exercise, but rather shapes the way missions understand local dynamics and conflict resolution? Thank you.
Thank you. The gentleman here.
Yes, thank you. And my name is Kutemwa. I'm a student at the University of Geneva. My question comes in regarding the conflict in the DRC. You know, it's been running for some time. It's on and off, on and off. So I think one of the panelists here mentioned issues to do with, let's say, capacity building of local security forces. I wanted to ask, and let's say if you have any knowledge, if at all, you know, any efforts have been made, you know, to capacitate the security agencies, the security institutions in the DRC, so that either they can be able to detect such conflicts, let's say even before they surface, or let's say even put in place, you know, measures whereby mediation and discussions can take place even before they escalate. Because now when we're looking at the usual response, you know, the peacekeeping missions going, we saw SADC was there, we didn't really do much of a good job there, now we're out. So what really can be done, you know, to at least curb this conflict? Thank you.
Thank you. Not an easy question. And there was, yeah, here.
Thank you. Thank you for the excellent panelists. I'm Inka Lili. I'm managing the DCAF's ELSI program. And actually, I have two questions. Can I have two or just one? Okay. So my first question is that there's a lot of discussion on efficiency. What is an efficient peace operation? And I mean, I think you all mentioned some aspects, but can you try to summarize that for me, like in 2 sentences? Like, what is for you an efficient operation? Because there's so much discussion on this. No, I know it's not an easy task. And then the other question, I would pick on the discussion on skills, like what kind of skills do future peacekeepers need? Because I think it's interesting to kind of, when we think about operationalizing, you know, all our big things, like what kind of skills the peacekeepers need in the future. Yeah, and I mean, we have researched into this a bit, but I want to hear your thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you so much. If there is any other question, we'll have a second round just after. So let's take these first 4, 5 questions. The one on gender stereotypes, the one on gender and diversity checkbox versus really shaping the missions. We have the question on the DRC and how to avoid escalation, having more mediation, conflict prevention, etc., capacity building of security forces. And then I think a question for all panelists on what's efficiency, effectiveness in peace operations and skills required to operationalize these components that we discussed today, SSG, WPS, and POC. Let's start with gender.
Yes, I'd be happy to kick us off, and I really appreciate the comments made. Thank you so much, colleagues. I think this is very important to be aware of that risk. And I think one way to circumvent this is really to invest in training and awareness raising for both, actually, to avoid gender stereotyping and to avoid the tick box exercise. Gender is not just about women, and I think it's important to really look at gender perspectives from diverse angles. And having training, for instance, on gender responsive leadership really supports in mitigating these risks. In addition, I think we also need to have training that is engaging and that is for troops and boots on the ground, because these are our majority of peacekeepers. And it needs to be clear that when we have gender equality, everyone benefits. And I think, yeah, that's what I would say to that.
Thank you. To the DRC question.
Can I also add to that?
Course,
yeah.
of course.
I mean, it's an interesting question about the stereotypes, but you know, the practical response for me would be, we have a mandate that we need to implement, and we want this to be effective. And Marie-Noëlle mentioned the engagement teams as one example. The moment we had mixed teams between, you know, men and female soldiers, indeed, we had very different results. You know, it was not just a patrol going through a village. You know, it was a patrol that came back with patrol reports that talked about security threats in the area, specific protection needs that were identified, and that is exactly what we need. So honestly, I'm not too much concerned about the stereotypes, although I think it's an interesting you know, discussion. We also have a demand that comes from the population. So again, I would say it's not ticking the box. It's an absolute necessity that we you know, listen to women and what they have to say. And also in the context of drawing down from one province, when we went to South Kivu, it was really, I mean, a 2-hour helicopter flight from Bukavu. It was really very remote. It was the women telling us that they were really concerned about the mission leaving because they were not clear about the protection and how it would continue. I mean, this was a strong message, of course. This was not orchestrated in any way. You know, we showed up. Basically, we said we would like to engage with the local protection committee, and this is, you know, what we heard. And by the way, I think it was also the men actually in that committee that very much listened also to the voices of the women that we heard. So that's what I want to say on that front. The DRC conflict, yeah, I mean. It's a long-lasting conflict that is embedded, I would say, in conflict drivers that go beyond the country, right? They are within the region, they are global conflict drivers also when you look into resources, supply chains, etc. I think what is important for us is when we as peace operation leave an area, we have the capacity to document human rights violations. We have the capacity to document armed group movements. We have the capacity to report basically on incidents, security incidents. It's important in the context also of shared responsibilities that I mentioned, that we share this information also. There has been a Centre de Coordination Opérationnelle in the DRC that we set up a couple of years ago in Goma, and then we also looked into using it in other sectors. And I think that was a good example of a co-location between MONUSCO and FARDC in this regard, where we were able to share information. I think what you also hint at is basically early warning capacities and not leading to the escalation. Of course, we have to also be very clear that the latest crisis was very much caused by an also unresolved issue. I mean, M23 have occupied the city of Goma already in 2012 and 13. So, you're right, we're going around in circles a little bit here. It is very much, I think, the responsibility, of course, also of the Security Council, of regional organizations, sub-regional organizations, to ensure that these conflicts are not escalating. And for that, we need to promote dialogue. For that, we need to also bring different actors together. And for many years, I believe it worked. But then, the moment you have an armed group basically occupying an important city like the city of Goma in this case, and the creation of de facto authorities, it becomes very, difficult to move, into a situation that you could describe as normal, because it is not normal at the moment, and therefore you have initiatives, you have peace agreements that have been developed, but they will also only be, I think, sustainable if those underlying causes of the conflict will be addressed. And I think that is an important responsibility, a shared responsibility. And I believe the actors are also aware of that. But that is, I think, just in a short way to say that it's an important question that you are asking, especially if we look into the conflict dynamics that have been observed for decades.
Thank you for tackling these hard questions. To the questions on gender, DRC, or maybe on the effectiveness or efficiency question?
I can very briefly address the efficiency question, which is a bit of a cop-out of an answer. I'm sorry, because it's always, it's context specific, unfortunately, but I think there are elements of it, that, so let me back up by saying the key components that our research has identified as being critical to effective delivery of protection of civilians mandates, for example, are not necessarily the ones that will exist moving forward. So we can reflect on them, and there are things like community liaison assistance and protection advisors and so forth. But I think the more important aspect is that whatever the components of that mission would look like, they need to be mutually reinforcing. They need to represent diverse expertise that was mentioned earlier, and in response to local needs. So I'm just reiterating what my colleagues have said, but I think there are a set of principles that can be applied to decisions on how do you prioritize among very limited capacity, and that all of that should have this, prevention orientation, this supporting local and national capacities. and in response to local needs. So again, a bit of a cheating answer, but trying to pull some of the threads together that we spoke about. On the skills question, what will future peacekeepers sort of skills look like? We didn't have a lot of chance to talk about it, but I would say new tech. We mentioned drones. I would also say around explosive weapons in populated areas. If you think about what a deployment to Ukraine might look like, or Gaza or other places, and the use of explosive weapons is I mean, it's shocking in the increase. I'd say Stratcom, strategic communications, because the use of disinformation and misinformation as a weapon of war, we're seeing a huge uptick in as well. I would also mention climate, peace, and security. So an understanding of the interrelationship of different risk factors, and specifically how climate is a risk multiplier for other risks. And then maybe around hybrid threats. And again, it just can look different in each place, but maybe to have that lens. Thanks. So I will just tackle, Inka, your question as well on the skills. And if we're talking about civilian capacities, I would really re-emphasize that we cannot expect to have all specialized skills within a team in a mission. That's the first thing. So it's really about how can we scale up, how can we leverage standing capacities, bilateral partnerships, etc. But then in terms of what skills I do think we need more on a kind of permanent basis, I would say political economy analysis, because I really do think that's lacking, and it links to kind of, you know, these reflections on how do we identify the risk factors for violence, how do we understand who are the, you know, winners, losers, you know, because that really dictates how we can engage on those very difficult political discussions. And then linked to that, I also think something really important is, I'm not sure if we call it mediation skills, but like facilitation skills. And by that, I mean that, you know, we often see that peace agreements in the area of security sector governance and reform, at least, they talk about, okay, you know, we will establish some kind of technical mechanism to deal with the sensitive issues down the line, because they just want to get the agreement signed, right? But then what's really sensitive is left for afterwards, when you no longer have those mediation specialists there. And it's kind of left to, you know, let's be honest, to the peacekeepers to actually facilitate some of those discussions, but they don't necessarily have those skills. And so how can we, you know, better link to DPPA, to their mediation experts, but also ensure that there are some people within the mission with those soft skills.
Thank you so much. And I'll be happy to actually to hear from you, Diana, a reaction on the skills, which are listed by colleagues, and then how it speaks to the current context of MONUSCO. But before that, we have two pending questions, I think, from the previous round here and the lady here. And if there are any sort of last question as well, we can take it in this last round. Yeah, so two other questions here in the back. Okay, so the lady here in the front, the gentleman, the lady here. Yeah.
Yeah, good morning. Dorota Delska from Information Climat. I work on climate extreme events, and we noticed for many years that climate extreme events, floods and heat waves increase faster than expected, and they are going to increase fast in the next years. So there is one report that expects up to 1 billion casualties in before 2050. It's due to droughts, to heat waves, several degrees higher heat waves, to huge floods and droughts, which reduce food production. Basically, it's climate change. Unhinged climate change is leading to sort of a genocide. And I wonder if you have any plans how to address it.
Thank you. So we'll take the questions and then get back to the panels, and I will try to wrap up maybe 2 or 3 minutes after the hour, after 2:30. So please.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Musab Athman. I'm working with the Women, Peace and Humanitarian Fund with UN Women. So I just have a quick question. How can we ensure that peace operations work closely with women organizations and grassroots organizations to ensure that, you know, they're involved in the process and to prevent conflict before it escalates? That's my question. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Nuna Calendar, and I'm studying my master's in transitional justice. My question relates to how you can essentially enforce governments to implement these mandates for these missions where they lack the will and the capacity to do so, and how in transitional justice there is a big emphasis on institutional reforms, where today it's a bit more difficult, but would you say in the future of peacekeeping also you could utilize more civil society efforts also, where today they occupy a bit more space on the peace agreement tables as well. So if you see their bigger role today and for the future of peace operations.
Thank you. The lady here at the front.
Thank you so much. Is it on? Okay. Thank you so much for the panel discussion. It was really, really insightful. I'm Parvina and I work at a negotiation consultancy firm. And we do a lot of, we consult with a lot of businesses, but we also have an arm that does a little like political consulting and stuff like this. I just had a question because for me, it's very interesting to hear more about the partnerships that you guys were talking about and like investments and your kind of your relationship with IFAs, for example, right? How do you plan to invest and fund a lot of these, for example, peacekeeping operations or missions? Would you consider ever maybe touching base into the private sector and engaging a lot of businesses and corporations to possibly fund a lot of these efforts? Because I realize that probably IFAs and a lot of the other ways that you get your investments, there's a lot of bottlenecks there. So what are your plans on that? Or thoughts?
Thank you. We'll have to stick to these last 4 questions. So one on the link to climate extreme events and how this impacts the environment of peace operations and how they can respond to it. The UN, the gentleman from UN Women asking questions about the links to the grassroots organization, also in terms of prevention. The question on how do we enforce or empower, I don't know, local government to implement mandates, including also bringing in more the civil society, and the question of the IFIs, and I think diversification of the funding, including private sector, etc. So who would like to kick us off? Would like Daniel?
Thank you. I mean, on the extreme weather, it's basically, the nexus of climate change and conflict. In the case of the DRC, there are studies that have been conducted and they fed into the common country assessment, and that is informing the programming cycle, so to say. And the focus, I think you mentioned it, is on food security, food insecurity. So this is very important. It's I think even reflected in our mandate in a way, but more as a context rather than as a mandated task. There was an attempt also to get funding for a climate risk advisor. So it is, I think, getting on the agenda, but of course it requires a multi-dimensional approach with a strong focus on food security. I would say it is also, of course, linked to internal movements, right? You have also displaced persons, of course, through conflict, but also there are attempts to understand patterns in terms of the harvest season and how things are shifting, including through rainfalls. Working with women associations, I think I gave a couple of examples. It is often either through the Human Rights Office or political affairs in peace operations. Civil affairs, of course, is also an important unit within an organization like ours, where we have access to civil society and women organizations, but we also work, with the UN agencies that are mandated for that. So I think that really works well. And in terms of the transition context, there were a lot of consultative workshops that we had organized, and the government agreed to that. I think, this is a good example of how advocacy actually can work. Can governments be empowered? I think would be maybe the term that I would prefer than forcing them. it's basically a mission with a very broad mandate, and you can only try to convince that it's worth investing into a specific sector, be it the security institutions or into the protection of civilians. But you don't do that actually by using strong language. You rather create opportunities for consultations, and these consultations then usually lead also to recommendations or a plan d'action. So I think we also have to accept the limitations, obviously, and if there is not what you call the political will or also the ability, or if you have a very fragmented let's say institutional landscape in a country, for instance, where you had a coup d'etat, I think it will be very difficult to get all these different actors together. And the partnership approach, yes, also here, I think we have good examples with the World Bank and the European Union also as an important contributor, and the bilaterals. So these things are working, but we need to ensure that the different frameworks that are guiding these processes are aligned. And often we see a multiplicity of strategic frameworks and planning processes, and then it is very important to bring that all together. And these different organizations have also different governing bodies and different planning cycles, funding mechanisms. So this is very important, and I think this is in a way an important element for the future of peace operations in terms of the funding. And that not everything should come from the assessed contributions from member states, but in areas where you do not have sufficient funding, you identify it as a gap, and you also, advocate for it. The challenge, however, is if you have a humanitarian response plan that remains notoriously under funded, and if humanitarian needs are still so big that you have to invest more into life-saving measures rather than into development funding, then I think you are facing a dilemma, obviously, and that is something I think that's quite important in the peace-building architecture that needs to be dealt with.
Yeah. Thank you, Daniel. Anyone would like to pick up on some of the questions?
So quickly.
Yeah, sure.
I know we're running right up against the time, so maybe just to complement that, on the women CSO question, I mean, I know one word answer: inclusion. In a way that's not a tick the box exercise, as we mentioned earlier, but something that's really built in from the design of the planning process, the peace process, whatever it is, just inclusion. I don't know why it's taken us so long to apply this as a system, but it remains an ambition that is not yet fulfilled. On compelling governments, I mean, obviously that's not something we can enforce, especially without a Chapter 7 mandate. However, there are two things that that Civic has done that we've seen have effective results, including with de facto authorities and with states that may be implicated in harm against their own civilians as well. One is portraying protection of civilians as a strategic military advantage. So not coming to them with an argument of sort of compliance with IHL, but actually helping to sort of understand the links between protecting civilians and legitimacy, and having more likelihood for achieving strategic military targets. And the second would be supporting the operationalization of that. What does it look like in practice? And there's a bunch of tools that we've seen that has worked. On the partnerships question, we always talk about bringing in the private sector. We're still really bad at it. Private sector isn't going to solve all of our problems, but they absolutely do have to be at the table, and we haven't quite figured out as a system how to do that well yet. Especially if we look at disarmament and autonomous weapon systems and the risk coming from them, we have to have engagement with weapons makers on those engaged in sort of arms cells and arms partnerships and security partnerships. So we put that in the to-do list, I think. And then the last one, peacekeeping missions aren't mandated to solve the climate crisis, but they are mandated lately. The last, the few big missions that we still have with POC mandates are mandated to take the consideration of the risk factors associated with climate as it relates to security.
into consideration, and they're starting to do that. And Civic, and I know we're not the only ones, have published some interesting research. I think it's interesting. I worked on it, looking at how South Sudan, for example, the UN mission in South Sudan has begun to do that, right, in a very kind of detailed way. So the Joint Operations Center and the Joint Mission Analysis Center, how are they bringing that analysis in, and what does it mean for operations?
Thank you for that. Okay. So I think with this we will close that conversation here. It was extremely rich. I won't try to summarize everything, but I think a few takeaways on my side. I really understood from all of you that it is very difficult to predict what future operations will look like, but there is a sense of urgency. So we need indeed to come with this recommendation and these dialogues in the next few weeks and months. It was very interesting to hear the strong linkages between security sector governance, POC, WPS, and you mentioned actually, Marie-Noelle, these links are inextricable, and if we don't link them all together, we might fall short of the results we want to reach. I also noted down, I think, a really important point, the shared responsibility, the missions, the national authorities, and the question of the national ownership, which is key, as well as, of course, having in perspective very concretely the demand from local populations and how we factor that in the prioritization of the missions' capacities and tasks. Another takeaway is around the investments, including through partners, but also which type of investments are being prioritized in missions, whatever shape and form they have. That investment must be early on the topic that we mentioned, and there has to be a minimum capacity on these questions to be built into the missions, whichever form and shape they might take. And the last point, which I think probably is not adding to the simplicity of the question, is those emerging themes that came out from the questions and also from UND in terms of the new technologies, the hybrid, the disinformation, misinformation, the climate. And we have been discussing for an hour and a half how the struggle and the challenge to make sure that SSG, POC, WPS are part of this minimal investment in missions. But in addition, we have these new themes and these new priorities and this new complexity coming up. So how does that sort of ultimately gets into the equation? So a lot of food for thought before the mission report is being made available in 2026. Thank you so much to our distinguished speakers and to the room here in Geneva and online for the very interesting conversation. Thank you so much.